Hi everyone, my name is Victoria Zaarour, and I'm currently a second year graduate student in the Industrial Organizational Psychology program at San Francisco State University. My passion for understanding people at work started with my experiences in diverse roles, from working in retail, supporting children as a behavior technician, and volunteering at a crisis hotline. I saw firsthand how workplace environments impact well-being and performance, which inspired me to dive deeper into how we can create healthier and more inclusive workplaces. My specific interests focus on employee well-being, especially in the high-stress fields like law enforcement, where I'm exploring how trauma-focused wellness programs can can combat burnout and improve retention.
Thank you, Victoria. Hi, everyone. My name is Luis Gutierrez, and I'm currently a second year graduate student in the IO Psych program at San Francisco State University as well. I graduated from San Jose State University in 2022 with a bachelor's in psychology and a minor in business. Here, I developed a keen interest in HR analytics and data-driven decision making. While undergoing my graduate studies, I primarily worked at Tesla's Fremont factory as a test driver and an assembly line production associate. My IO psychology research interests include AI, training and development, person analytics, and employee motivation. I've worked with Dr. Sanchez's Work Tech Lab, where I learned how to peer edit papers, lead a project on VR perceptions, and was also the program coordinator for Muse, which is a mentorship program for undergraduates seeking graduate school. In my free time, I enjoy playing video games, watching movies, and exercising.
Thank you, Luis. It's super impressive to see how much you've done.
Thank you.
All right, so let's kick things off by talking about the different career paths available in IO psychology. It's such a versatile field, so let's start with consulting.
Absolutely. Consulting is probably one of the most dynamic areas for IO psychologists. In consulting roles, we work directly with organizations to address some of their biggest challenges. This could be improving employee engagement, building leadership development programs, or even helping shift company culture.
Right, and a great example here is designing training programs that are not just effective, but also tailored to the organization's unique needs. Or maybe revising recruitment processes to ensure they're not just fair, but also efficient. Have you ever come across that problem?
Oh, totally. In our training and development class, we designed our own training programs to address the needs of fictional organization. My group created a sexual harassment training program that addressed the organization's issues with maintaining a respectful workplace and understanding a manager's role in maintaining psychological safety.
Oh, yeah, that's a perfect example. I remember that project. But consulting isn't the only path, right? IO psychologists can also thrive in human resources.
For sure, HR roles let IO professionals work more deeply within a single organization. You'd be focusing on things like talent management,
Hmm.
performance reviews, or even organizational development strategies. For instance, you might create an employee wellness program to help people manage stress and boost productivity.
Or something like diversity and inclusion initiatives. I've read that IO psychologists are behind many cutting-edge DEI efforts, like developing inclusive hiring practices.
Exactly. And then for those who love knowledge, there's always research and academia. This path involves studying workplace trends and teaching the next generation of IO psychologists. One hot topic in research right now is how remote work is influencing productivity and employee satisfaction.
Oh, yeah, I read a study recently that found employees tend to be more productive in hybrid work setups, something that IO psychologists are really helping companies optimize right now.
Lastly, we can't forget about specialized roles. These are newer, more niche areas like data analytics, workplace safety, or even leadership coaching. These roles take IO skills into very focused applications, and they're growing fast thanks to the evolving workplace.
For sure. All right, so for our second segment, we're going to go dive deeper into the future of work in IO psychology. For this next segment, we're going to be tackling something that I think is pretty important, the changing nature of work and how it all ties into, well, frankly, inequality.
We've moved pretty dramatically away from what researchers call internal labor markets, or ILMS for short, and tour system.
That's wow, it's way more open and driven by the market. So ILMS, for those of us who weren't around back then, what did that actually look like?
Okay, so imagine you finish school, get a job at a company. Basically, you climb the ladder within that same company, you enter your career. Promotions based on how long you've been there. Seniority pay was determined internally, and long-term employment, that was just the norm. It was expected people would often spend their entire working lives with one company.
Wow, that's such a different world than all of the job hopping we see today.
It's wild. Something that really surprised me was that the research suggests even labor unions push for this company system. I mean, that doesn't seem like it would be in the interest to limit their workers' ability to move between companies and stuff.
Yeah, it might seem counterintuitive right now, but back then, unions were really focused on securing stability and fairness for their members and the ILM system. With its predictable career paths and those internal pay scales, it provided that sense of security. And it was like a compromise between what management wanted control and what labor wanted protection. It makes you wonder if maybe the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction these days.
But before we get into all of that, I'm really curious about what caused this shift in the first place. Technology is often mentioned as a driver.
Oh, absolutely. It definitely links advancement in things like it to this change. It's easier to communicate and coordinate across markets now, so you need fewer people working in-house. Plus, you've got globalization happening at the same time. Increased competition globally, like pushed companies to find ways to be more flexible and to cut costs, which often meant moving towards these market-driven employment models where they could quickly adapt.
So it sounds like businesses were under pressure to be leaner and meaner to survive.
Exactly. And then you have the decline of union power in a lot of industries that definitely played a part too. As unions lost their influence, a lot of those worker protections that were part of that old ILM system, well, they faded away, right? But it wasn't just economics.
Oh yeah, no. There were also political shifts happening.
Like what?
Well, particularly in the 80s, there was a big move towards deregulation, less government intervention, exactly, and a greater emphasis on free markets. This all created an environment where companies were much more likely to move away from that old ILM model. So it's like a whole mix of things coming together. Technology, bot economics, politics. But the research also points to the agendas of different stakeholders, like everyone was trying to pull the whole employment relationship in their own direction.
That's a great way to put it. Like, look at shareholders. They started prioritizing shareholder value above all else, which meant companies were under pressure to maximize profits, often by cutting costs and adopting employment practices that were more flexible, even if it meant less security for workers.
Exactly. And then you have the HR departments. It's
Mhm.
fascinating. They were initially really important in establishing those ILMS, but then they had to adapt to this new reality that is interesting.
What stood out to you about HR roles in all of this?
Well, they were really clever about it. They took things like diversity management and work-family benefits, which were initially seen as both to promote fairness and equality, and they reframed them as tools to attract talent and ultimately boost shareholder value. It just shows how stakeholders can change their strategies to fit whatever's going on, even if it means moving away from focusing on the well-being of workers.
So we've got shareholders pushing for profit and HR kind of shifting their focus to support that. Were there any other players in this whole tug of war over the workplace?
Oh yeah, definitely. You can't forget about all the social movements.
Oh, right. Pushing for rights, women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, all of that.
These movements push for things like diversity initiatives and work-life balance policies, so they had a real impact.
Absolutely. It shows that stakeholders outside of the traditional corporate structure can have a big influence on employment practices. It makes you think these movements, while fighting for social justice, they may be accidentally contributing to dismantling the ILM model by pushing for more flexibility and individualization in the workplace. It's definitely something to consider unintended consequences.
Coincidence, exactly. You can't just look at one stakeholder in isolation. It's all about how their actions interact and create this complex web of cause and effect. It's complicated and fascinating.
Definitely fascinating. Okay, so we've gone from this world of like company men and these internal labor markets to this system that's way more open and driven by market forces. But what does that actually mean for workers? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing?
Somewhere in between, that's the big question, isn't it? And to really get it, we have to look at what these changes have done to inequality.
Okay, so the research paints a pretty complicated picture.
In what way?
Well, there are both positive and negative consequences.
Okay, so let's break that down. When we say inequality in this context, what are we actually talking about?
Good question. We can think about it on different levels. There's inequality within jobs where people doing the same work might be rewarded differently. Then there's inequality across jobs, meaning some jobs offer better pay and conditions than others, right? And then there's inequality between stakeholders, like how the benefits of economic growth are distributed between, say, shareholders and workers. So it's bigger than just who earns more. It's about who has access to opportunities and security and a good quality of life.
You got it. And the research has some really concrete examples of how these different levels of inequality actually play out. Like what one of the most striking is the rise of the gig economy.
Oh, yeah, the gig economy, those app-based jobs like ride sharing and food delivery. It's everywhere these days. But how does that tie into this whole shift away from ILM?
Well, the gig economy is almost like the perfect example of market-driven employment. It gives you flexibility and the potential to earn money, but it often lacks those traditional protections and benefits that came with the standard employment under the ILM system. So gig workers are taking on more risk. They're exposed to the ups and downs of the market without the same safety net.
Yeah, they often have unpredictable incomes. They lack benefits like health insurance or paid time off, and they have very little recourse of if they're treated unfairly by a platform.
I can see how that would contribute to inequality. If your
Mhm.
income is constantly changing and you have no safety net, it's got to be hard to get ahead. It is, but it goes beyond just individual workers.
What do you mean?
There are bigger societal impacts too. The research suggests that this shift toward more open and market-driven employment can actually weaken social cohesion.
How?
So, well, when people feel less secure in their jobs and they have fewer shared experiences with colleagues, it can lead to less social trust and weaken ties within community. So, like, we're losing that sense of solidarity that comes from working together toward a common goal. Now, everyone's out for themselves.
I see. It's definitely a concern. It's a bit of a bleak picture. Does the research offer any solutions to these challenges?
It does. It's not all doom and gloom. It also explores some potential ways forward.
Oh, like what?
Well, one area that gets a lot of attention is the role of government regulation.
So, like bringing back some of those worker protections that were lost with the decline of unions and ILMs.
Exactly. Think updating labor laws to better fit the realities of the gig economy.
So, how would that work?
Well, for example, making sure gig workers are covered by minimum wage laws, providing access to portable benefits that follow workers from job to job, and strengthening their right to organize and collectively bargain.
So, those sound like important steps, but are those things actually happening or is it all just talk?
There are some promising developments. For example, some cities and countries are experimenting with portable benefit systems for gig workers, and there's growing support for legislation that would clarify the employment status for gig workers, which would give them access to those basic labor protections.
That's good to hear. Are there any other solutions being explored that maybe go beyond traditional government regulation?
Definitely. The research highlights this really interesting concept called platform cooperativism.
Platform cooperativism. Hard to pronounce. I've never heard of that.
Imagine a ride-sharing app, but instead of being owned by a corporation and answering to shareholders, it's owned and operated by the drivers themselves as a co-op. So it's like taking the power of the platform and putting it in the hands of the workers.
That's a really interesting idea. It's about democratizing, I can't pronounce that, the gig economy and making sure that the benefits are shared more fairly. Are there any challenges with that?
Oh, of course. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a potential path forward, a more just and sustainable model. It's inspiring to see people coming up with creative solutions like that, but realistically, can these platform cooperatives really compete with the big tech companies?
But that's a good question, and it's something researchers are looking into. While platform cooperatives might not replace those giants overnight, they offer a different model that can inspire innovation and put pressure on those traditional platforms to be more ethical and worker friendly.
So competition leading to positive change, right? Are there any other reasons to be hopeful that the research points to?
For sure, we're also seeing new labor organizations and advocacy groups popping up that are specifically focused on representing workers in the gig economy and other non-traditional employment arrangements. It's like those social movements we talked about earlier. Workers are finding new ways to organize and advocate for their rights. And it's important to remember the future of work isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the choices we make, the policies we support, and the actions we take. It's a collective effort.
It is. We've been talking about this big shift from the company men era to this more open system we have today. But I'm guessing this doesn't look the same everywhere. How does this all play out in different industries?
You're right, Luis. The impact does vary depending on the industry. One area that's seen a really big transformation is in sectors where a lot of the tasks could be digitalized, like e-commerce, delivery services, online platforms, all of that.
Right. So the world of algorithms and automation. I've heard a lot about algorithmic management, but honestly, it sounds kind of sci-fi. What does that actually look like?
Well, it's not quite robots taking over, but algorithms are playing a bigger role in how work is structured, monitored, evaluated, all of it. So, in these digital industries, algorithms are basically calling the shots in a lot of ways. They're used to track how productive workers are, how to assign tasks, and even determine pay and making hiring decisions.
That's a lot of power for lines of code. I can see how that would be more efficient, but are there downsides too?
That's the key question, isn't it? The research highlights this real tension. On one hand, algorithmic management could reduce bias. It takes a human element out of it, all that potential for prejudice and stuff. And of course, it could definitely make things more efficient, so less room for human error or favoritism.
I get why management would like that, but what about the workers?
That's where the concerns come in.
Like what?
Well, one worry is that algorithms could actually make existing inequalities worse if they aren't designed carefully. Like, imagine an algorithm that's trained on old hiring data, data that reflects, like racial or gender bias. That would be very bad. It could end up replicating these biases even though it's not supposed to, right? It's like that saying, garbage in, garbage out. Even if the algorithm itself is neutral, the data it's based on might not be right.
Are there other concerns?
Yeah, definitely. There are concerns about worker autonomy and, well, being in that way, constantly being watched and evaluated by this invisible algorithm.
It sounds stressful.
It is. It could be incredibly stressful. Yeah, and dehumanizing. Like, you're always being watched, which can lead to anxiety and burnout. I can see how that would impact morale, but it sounds like this is the future. Algorithmic management is here to stay.
Seems that way. Is there any way to make it better?
That's what researchers and policymakers are trying to figure out. There's a lot of talk about needing more transparency.
Transparency?
Yeah, so workers understand how these algorithms work, how decisions are being made, and there's a push for regulations to protect workers from unfair or discriminatory algorithms. It's definitely a work in progress, though.
It sounds like we're still figuring this whole thing out. You mentioned earlier that this all plays out differently in different industries. What about those high-paying professional jobs like law, consulting, accounting? Are they changing too?
Well, even those professions aren't immune.
How so?
Well, one trend we're seeing is the rise of what's called stretch work.
Stretch work? What's that?
So imagine you're hired as an accountant, but you're also expected to do some marketing, event planning, maybe even some basic legal tasks. That's stretch work. So they're being asked to do more, way more beyond their traditional roles. And it sounds like they're being stretched thin. They are longer hours, definitely pressured, exactly. So It often leads to work life bleeding into their personal life. It's hard to switch off when your job responsibilities are so broad. So even those high paying jobs are maybe not so great anymore. It's a trade off.
Are there any other trends in those fields?
Yeah, well, we're also seeing more reliance on contract work and outsourcing, even for highly skilled stuff. While law firms might hire freelance legal researchers, consulting firms might outsource data analysis to independent contractors.
So it's a way to get specialized skills without having full-time employees.
Exactly.
So even in these stable professions, there's a move toward more flexibility, but also less security.
That's the trend. It's like that same trade-off we've been talking about. More flexibility for workers, but less job security and often even fewer benefits.
Yep, it seems like the world of work is changing everywhere. It makes you wonder what's next. The future of work is always evolving.
That's very true. It's shaped by new technologies, global forces, and what workers and employers do. But like we talked about earlier, the future isn't set in stone. We shape it through our choices and actions.
It's a good point. It can feel kind of overwhelming to think about these big changes, but we're not powerless. So what can we do to navigate this and make sure the future of work is good for everyone?
Well, one thing we can do is to be adaptable and keep learning.
Keep learning, yeah.
So the skills that are in demand today might not be needed tomorrow, and we have to keep up.
Exactly. Stay curious, keep learning new things, be willing to reinvent yourself.
It's like they say, the only constant is change.
That's it. So we need to change with it. And while technical skills are important, don't forget about those soft skills.
Oh, yeah, soft skills, things like communication, collaboration, problem solving, and critical thinking.
All right, those human skills, they're harder to automate, make sense, and they're becoming more and more valuable because they're harder to find in a way.
Yeah, they're the skills that help us connect, solve problems, and thrive in a world that's constantly changing. It's not just what you know, it's how you learn and adapt.
Exactly. Anything else?
Stay informed, talk about these issues, support policies that help workers, and promote responsible technology.
We all have a role to play in making a better future. It's a call to action. We can't just wait and see what happens. We have to be part of creating a world of work that's good for everyone.
This has been a very fascinating conversation. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the changing world of work and its impact on inequality. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a more just and equitable future for everyone. Until next time.
And that's a wrap on this season. Thank you all for joining us on this journey as we explored the fascinating world of industrial organizational psychology from the introduction of IO, discussing assessment-based practices, diving deeper into training, learning about organizational culture, looking at IO in practice, and exploring the future of IO.
We hope these conversations sparked some curiosity, inspired new ideas, and gave you valuable insights into how psychology shapes our workplaces and beyond. Remember, the work we do in IO isn't just about organizations, it's about people.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.